Imagine this: millions of tons of water gushing into the cracked earth of the desert, not by accident, not by nature's mercy, but by the will of one man. In the heart of Burkina Faso, a country often ignored in the shuffle of global headlines, something unimaginable is happening. Where sand once ruled like a tyrant, now green sprouts push through. Where drought used to choke the land, now water flows in defiance. And behind it all, Ibrahim Traoré. They said it couldn't be done. They said the desert was a death sentence. But this man, he did not listen. He didn't just dream of farms in the sand, he poured them into existence. This is no ordinary news from Africa. This is revelation. This is restoration. And if you've never heard this story on Africa News, maybe, just maybe, they didn't want you to. Don't you look away now. Subscribe, stay with me, and witness how one of the most forgotten places on earth became a rising oasis, through blood, grit, and a faith unshaken. Pouring water into the desert, the first step of a national rebirth. It sounds like poetry, but in Burkina Faso it is no longer a metaphor. It is policy. It is action. It is the work of a people determined to reverse the verdict of nature and the verdict of history. For decades, the Sahel crept southward, a slow and merciless invasion. Rains grew shorter, wells sank deeper. Families who had lived off the land for generations began to abandon their villages. By 2022, more than 70% of Burkina Faso's territory had been classified as degraded or desertified. Harvests failed. Herds disappeared. Children grew up without ever seeing green fields. Hope was drying up faster than the rivers. Into this crisis stepped a young leader, not draped in the cliches of politics, but in the discipline of the military. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, just 37, calm in appearance but unshakable in his resolve, took power at a time when few believed the country had a future. To the outside world, he was another name in the headlines. To his people, he was something else entirely, a man who refused to let their nation die quietly. He did not promise miracles. He promised work. And behind that work lay a vision as audacious as it was simple, to fight the desert with water, with wisdom, and with willpower. He called it not a project, but a duty, to restore the dignity of the land and the dignity of those who lived on it. The campaign began almost invisibly. In remote provinces, villagers started digging strange round holes in barren ground. These were not random pits. They were zai pits, an ancestral technique that captures scarce rainwater and nourishes young plants. Traoré's government revived this practice on a massive scale, training thousands of farmers, soldiers, and volunteers to dig and plant. Side by side with the pits came stone bunds, low walls of rock across fields to slow runoff and allow the earth to drink deeply again. But the revival did not stop with tradition. Traoré insisted on blending old and new. Solar-powered pumps appeared in communities that had never had electricity. Rainwater harvesting systems were fitted to schools and clinics. Deep aquifer wells were drilled by local engineers, not foreign contractors. Entire villages worked together to build reservoirs large enough to store millions of liters of water. The idea was simple but radical. Stop chasing the rain. Start directing it. Slowly, stubbornly, the land responded. Within 2 planting seasons, patches of green began to spread across what had been lifeless dust. Millet and sorghum sprouted again. Mango trees bloomed where none had for years. Families returned to plots they had abandoned. Children splashed in full wells and ran through furrows of young crops. In one province alone, over 15,000 hectares of degraded land were rehabilitated. This was not aid, it was agency. It was a people saying, "We will not wait to be saved. We will save ourselves." One grandmother in the north said quietly, I thought I would die without seeing maize grow here again. Now my grandchildren will eat from this soil. Meanwhile, the outside world barely noticed. Africa news carried brief mentions, but no headlines. International donors stayed cautious. Yet inside Burkina Faso, the change was undeniable. Traoré did not seek applause. He kept moving from village to village, kneeling in the soil, speaking little, working much. His presence was less like a politician campaigning and more like a preacher planting seeds of faith. The strategy was bigger than agriculture. It was about pride, sovereignty, and the refusal to be defined by scarcity. "We are not the desert," he told one gathering. "We are the rain." And for the first time in decades, the people began to believe him. But as the fields turned green, questions began to rise like mist after a storm. This scale of transformation, the reservoirs, the pumps, the coordination, demanded more than goodwill. It required money, logistics, and a hidden architecture of support. Burkina Faso, under sanctions and diplomatic isolation, should not have had the capacity to pour millions of tons of water into lands the world had written off as dead. And yet, it was happening. Who was making it possible? Where was the real backing coming from? And was this merely a collection of local efforts or part of a far more sophisticated, concealed strategy? Because one thing was certain: the desert was retreating. But it was not retreating on its own. Someone, somewhere, was leading it away. The green surge, hope grows, and so does resistance. It began in whispers. In village after village, fields once abandoned were blooming. Sorghum and millet danced again in the wind. The air smelled not of dust, but of damp earth and promise. Women walked to the wells no longer to stare into emptiness, but to draw. Men who had long migrated to the coast returned, not just for a visit, but with tools in their hands and seeds in their pockets. Burkina Faso was stirring, and the world could feel it. The green was no longer a fluke, it was a force. Entire regions once written off as beyond recovery were now producing more food than they had in a decade. Satellite images showed bright bands of vegetation cutting across former dust plains. Villagers renamed their neighborhoods from La Faim, hunger, to Espoir, hope. Children were no longer taught how to flee the land. They were taught how to feed it. At the heart of this movement was not a political slogan, but a man whose boots were muddy, whose hands were calloused, and whose leadership was unlike anything modern Burkina Faso had seen. Ibrahim Traoré had become more than a captain. To many, he was now a symbol, not just of revival, but of resistance. But where hope grows fast, fear is never far behind. Inside the country, Traoré's actions ignited something powerful: a sense of ownership. Local governments began organizing agricultural cooperatives with zero dependence on international donors. Traditional chiefs, once sidelined by urban bureaucracy, were brought back into the fold to manage land restoration efforts. The national curriculum was updated to include courses on dryland farming, climate resilience, and indigenous land techniques. It wasn't just a movement, it was a model. And that is what began to trouble outsiders. You see, the world had long been comfortable with the image of Africa as needy, as dependent, as waiting. But what was happening in Burkina Faso was none of that. It was strategic, it was indigenous, it was successful. And it was happening without permission. Western NGOs that had once operated with full access were suddenly irrelevant. Their million-dollar reports, their consultant-led pilot projects, were being outperformed by villagers with shovels and ancestral memory. The headlines were quiet. The think tanks were confused. Meanwhile, across the ocean, something else began to shift. In corners of Black America, people started sharing images of the miracle farms on platforms that mainstream news had ignored. "Why is no one talking about this?" asked one grandmother from Atlanta. "Why isn't this on CNN?" whispered another in Detroit. Some called it the Burkina model. Others called it a blueprint for a new African century. And for the first time in years, many in the diaspora found themselves inspired, not by speeches, but by seedlings. But not everyone was applauding. Behind the scenes, resistance began to mount. Local elites, many of whom had profited from the status quo, grew uncomfortable. They had long controlled the import of foreign food, the allocation of land grants, the flow of international funds. But in Traoré's Burkina Faso, those pipelines were being shut off. Foreign governments began to raise quiet concerns. The idea of a self-sufficient African nation, led not by a Western-backed technocrat but by a military reformist, was unnerving. Some reports even suggested that certain powers began pressuring regional bodies to impose stricter oversight on Burkina Faso's activities under the guise of environmental verification and fiscal transparency. Others were more blunt. A leaked internal document from a European development agency read, "This model, if replicated across the Sahel, will fundamentally undermine our influence." Still, Traoré said little. He did not retaliate with press conferences or accusations. He simply doubled down. More reservoirs, more wells, more reclaimed land, more silence, and more results. But whispers of sabotage began to surface. Farming equipment shipments were delayed at ports. International grants promised years ago were suddenly under review. Even some local leaders who had once praised the campaign now began to speak of mismanagement and overreach. It became clear this was no longer just about agriculture. It was about power. Because what Traoré had planted in the soil wasn't just food, it was a new kind of independence. One rooted in the land, one that did not ask permission, one that other nations, if inspired, might try to copy. And that, more than the crops, more than the water, terrified those who relied on Africa's dependence to remain in control. So they began to plan. But what they didn't know was that Traoré had been planning too. The fruits of defiance, when growth becomes a threat. It started with a harvest, not a massive one, not enough to shock the markets or draw headlines, but enough to feed the village of Koudougou for the first time without outside aid in nearly 10 years, enough to send children to school with full stomachs, enough for a young man named Musa, who once begged for factory work in Ghana, to come home and plant again beside his aging father. And then it multiplied. In Yatanga, farmers who once stood in food lines began selling surplus grain. In Bobo Dioulasso, local cooperatives exported sun-dried tomatoes to neighboring Mali. In the central regions, women-led farming groups started turning shea butter production into profitable micro-industries. And as the crops grew, so did the confidence. For decades, Burkina Faso had been spoken of only as a crisis, a place of insurgency, drought, poverty. But now, there was a quiet shift in tone. No longer the victim, no longer the waiting room of foreign intervention. Now, it was a nation learning to stand, not with borrowed crutches, but on calloused feet and fertile ground. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had promised more than food. He had promised dignity. And with every full basket of millet, every restored well, every school meal not dependent on UN donations, that promise was being kept. The youth noticed. Migration numbers fell sharply. Former émigrés returned not just for holidays, but for business. New training centers in regenerative agriculture opened. University students no longer aspired only to jobs in France or the UN. Some wanted to be farmers, proudly. In dusty towns where once only hopelessness grew, Now people spoke of plans, greenhouses, seed banks, markets, independence, and that, more than anything, began to scare the old powers, because independence is beautiful until it becomes contagious. The Burkina model began to attract attention in places it was never meant to reach. Delegations from Mali and Niger arrived quietly to study the irrigation layouts. Local leaders in Chad requested blueprints for Zai pit training. Even grassroots organizations in Ghana and Senegal reached out, asking for tools, maps, guidance. The idea that a poor, landlocked nation could restore itself from the ground up, without loans, without conditions, was no longer an anecdote. It was becoming a precedent. But with influence comes friction. Within Traoré's own country, not everyone celebrated. Former bureaucrats, sidelined by the decentralization of land management, began whispering of irregular practices. Private contractors who once monopolized foreign-funded projects suddenly found themselves irrelevant and bitter. International NGOs, shut out of projects they once managed, began filing concern reports about environmental safety and financial transparency. It escalated fast. At first, it was small things. Equipment deliveries blocked at borders, fuel supplies delayed. Then came the media. A handful of major outlets began running stories casting doubt on the sustainability of Traoré's initiatives. Experts warned of environmental risks, of overstated success rates, of the danger of empowering non-democratic actors in land reform. Reports surfaced suggesting the movement was militarized agriculture, a phrase no one had used before, but suddenly echoed across think tanks and policy circles. Even as the fields grew greener, the diplomatic soil was drying up. Trade deals stalled. Embassies issued vague travel warnings. Donor conferences postponed promised funding indefinitely. When a United Nations delegation finally visited, they praised the grassroots efforts but warned against concentration of power. The irony was lost on no one that sovereignty had become suspect. Inside the country, the pressure was felt. There were whispers of foreign-backed NGOs funding alternative leadership dialogues, code for opposition. A few minor protests erupted, seemingly out of nowhere, calling for transparency in water management. Their slogans were oddly similar to Western development rhetoric. Still, Traoré did not crack. He traveled more, held open forums in remote provinces, visited youth co-ops. And every time someone asked if the outside world would stop this movement, he answered the same. They can stop the money, but they cannot stop the rain. But behind the boldness, the tension grew. Everyone knew the next move was coming. Someone, somewhere, would push back, not with arguments, but with action. Because when seeds turn to harvest and harvest turns to power, those who rely on your hunger to control you will try to burn your fields. And now, in this new season of green and resistance, one question must be asked, not of the West, not of governments, but of us, the African diaspora, the watchers, the believers. If you are a Black American, do you support this? Do you believe in the Burkina model? Would you defend it? Not just in principle, but in practice? The world watches, doubt, silence, and awakening. At first, the world barely noticed. Burkina Faso had never occupied much space in the minds of foreign policymakers. Landlocked, poor, politically unstable, a country to be managed, not watched, a place to deliver aid, not expect innovation from. So when whispers began circulating about irrigation projects, returning migrants, and record harvests, most in Washington, Paris, and Brussels brushed it off as anecdotal, another temporary local success. But the numbers kept climbing, and the green kept spreading. And slowly something began to shift, not in official statements. Those remained cautious, measured, full of diplomatic smoke, but in the corridors of power, In classified briefings and private discussions, the question started to rise. What if this works? Because if it worked in Burkina Faso, a country under sanctions, limited resources, and almost no Western support, it could work anywhere. France, the former colonial power, said little. But its state media shifted tone. First came concern about democratic legitimacy, then warnings about militarized agriculture, then articles suggesting environmental risks. The message was subtle but clear. Progress that did not follow their script was dangerous. The United States remained publicly neutral. The State Department avoided direct commentary, but USAID scaled back existing operations. Intelligence reports noted growing alignment with non-Western development models. Policy analysts called it a sovereignty-driven strategy that bypasses traditional frameworks. A polite way of saying they're doing it without us, and it's working. But not everyone stayed silent. Across the ocean, in barbershops in Baltimore, bookstores in Atlanta, churches in Detroit, and community centers in Oakland, a different conversation was unfolding. Black Americans, often fed a steady stream of negative portrayals of Africa, began to see something new and profoundly familiar. Clips of Traoré inspecting farms, laughing with elders, planting with children, began circulating on social media. Posts titled, "This is what Black leadership looks like," gained traction. Pan-African forums exploded with engagement. "He's not just leading Burkina Faso," one user wrote. "He's leading a movement, and we need to pay attention." For many in the diaspora, especially the older generation who remembered the civil rights movement, the tone felt familiar. Traoré wasn't speaking in development jargon. He was speaking the language of dignity, sovereignty, and self-determination. Words that echoed Malcolm, echoed Kwame, echoed Marcus Garvey. Meanwhile, in Africa, the ripple effects grew stronger. Mali and Niger both announced soil regeneration campaigns modeled after the Burkina Initiative. Guinea launched a youth agriculture corps inspired by it. Across the Sahel, nations long dismissed as unsalvageable began to see themselves differently, not as wards of the West, but as architects of their own renewal. Even the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, after months of silence, acknowledged the unprecedented success of community-led land restoration in the region. Quietly, their experts requested a field study in northern Burkina. Even they could no longer pretend not to see. But this is not just a moment, it is a question. Because if Burkina Faso can do this without loans, without lectures, without leaning on old powers, then what else might be possible for Africa? And deeper still, what happens when a continent stops asking for help and starts leading its own revolution? The road ahead, from green shoots to a continental dream. Burkina Faso was never meant to lead. It was meant to survive, barely. It was meant to wait, to borrow, to plead for development at round tables far from its soil. But the rains came back, the seeds returned, and the people stood up, not with empty hands, but with harvest in their arms. Now the question is no longer, can we do it? It is, what comes next? Captain Ibrahim Traoré has made his position clear. This is not a moment. This is a movement. His government has announced plans to extend the land recovery project across all 13 regions of Burkina Faso by 2030. The goal is not just food security, but ecological sovereignty, to restore rivers, rebuild seed banks, revive local farming cultures, and redraw the map of what is considered arable in Africa. And he's calling on his people, especially the young, to return, to bring their minds home, to plant their talents where their ancestors planted hope. Universities are being urged to create programs focused on agroecology and climate resilience. Vocational schools are training thousands in well drilling, soil restoration, and sustainable land use. The message is not subtle. Don't run from the desert, reclaim it. But this new path comes with new dangers. With every step forward, the pressure tightens. Sanctions linger. Trade barriers loom. Disinformation spreads. The global order, built on the narrative of Africa's dependence, now faces an uncomfortable truth. Burkina Faso is doing what no one said it could. And that threatens more than just economic models. It threatens control. There are whispers of regime change, quiet funds being funneled into opposition, foreign advisors offering stabilization packages in exchange for political access. The road ahead will not be paved in applause. It will be carved in resistance, and Traoré knows it. In a rare public address, he said, "We do not need your charity. We need you to get out of our way. Respect our right to rise." This is not the language of dependency. It is the language of revolution. Quiet, patient, green. But he cannot walk it alone. Because while the land is rising, the threats are circling, and every harvest gained brings a new storm. There will be temptations to compromise, to water down the dream, to trade sovereignty for safety. And those who once applauded may begin to accuse. So now the question turns not just to Burkina Faso, but to us. Who will walk with them? Who will defend a vision not made in Paris or Washington, but in the dust and sweat of the Sahel? Who will believe in the dignity of local wisdom, the power of small farms, the miracle of returning rain? Because the road ahead is long, but the first steps have already shaken the earth. From dust to destiny. The new name of Africa. In a world that has grown used to Africa being defined by crisis, Burkina Faso dares to write a different story, one not penned in boardrooms or donor conferences, but in the soil, in the hands of farmers, in the wells dug by calloused palms, in the green that now grows where only dust once ruled. And at the center of it all stands a man not chasing fame, but sowing a future, Ibrahim Traoré. He has shown us what leadership can look like when it is rooted in land, not luxury, in action, not applause, in people, not protocol. This is not just his victory, it is a seed for all of us. Imagine if 10 more African nations followed suit. Imagine if every village reclaimed its own fields. Imagine if every child in the Sahel grew up not fearing the desert, but defeating it. This is no longer a fantasy. It is unfolding before our eyes. And yet, most of the world still hasn't looked. If you only rely on mainstream Africa news, you might never hear about this. You might never know that one of the world's poorest countries is leading one of its most powerful revivals. But now you do. And the question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you scroll past it? Or will you share it? Will you let the silence continue? Or will you speak the truth louder? If you believe that black leadership matters, if you believe that dignity cannot be imported but must be rooted, if you believe that our elders were right when they said, "We are the ones we've been waiting for," then say it. Write it. Comment below. Let the world know. Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, is not a story of yesterday. He is the beginning of tomorrow. This is Africa news they didn't want to tell you, but we just did. So subscribe, stay with us, and let's keep watching this continent rise. One harvest, one well, one revolution at a time.